En las familias discutimos.
Families, we quarrel,
En las familias a veces vuelan los platos.
and sometimes plates can fly.
It started with a whisper, a chilling, breathless murmur that swept through the marbled halls of the Apostolic Palace like a ghost. Il Papa non sta bene. The Pope is not well. I was in the press corridor, half asleep and reviewing notes for a late-night article, when a senior Vatican aide rushed past, pale and trembling. There was something different about the urgency this time. Papal health rumors were common, but this was heavier. I dropped everything and followed the trail toward the papal residence. The silence in the hall was deafening. Guards stood rigid. Nuns clutched rosaries. Priests moved like shadows. Something sacred was breaking. I would later realize this wasn't just a medical emergency. This was the slow collapse of a spiritual giant. The Vatican, usually a fortress of tradition and control, was suddenly human, vulnerable. And I was there, caught in the moment before history cracked wide open. A secret corridor beneath the Apostolic Palace. Few outsiders know of the narrow, candle-lit corridor beneath the Apostolic Palace, used only during moments of deep secrecy. I had only heard whispers of its existence, but that night I was ushered into it. A Swiss guard who recognized me nodded wordlessly and motioned me down. I followed in silence, heart pounding. The air smelled of incense and age. Faint Latin prayers echoed from distant chapels. As I moved deeper, I passed hidden rooms, some sealed, others filled with archives and paintings covered in cloth. Then I reached a wooden door, guarded by 2 cardinals. Behind it, the final hours of Pope Francis were quietly unfolding. I wasn't supposed to be there. I wasn't clergy, but something in the air, some divine pull, had made room for witnesses. What I saw on the other side would scar me forever. The Holy Father, once a titan of reform, was now a fragile man battling time and breath. The Pope's final room. Candlelight, silence, and shadows. The Pope's final room was dimly lit, illuminated by no more than 5 candles. The crucifix on the wall cast long shadows across the floor. Pope Francis lay in a modest bed, not the luxurious kind one might expect for the leader of 1.3 billion Catholics, but one of humility. A white linen blanket, his well-worn rosary in hand. Around him stood a small circle, 2 cardinals, a personal physician, 1 elderly nun, and, unbelievably, his sister, Maria Elena. Her eyes were swollen from tears, but she remained composed. Francis, though barely breathing, whispered in soft Spanish, often referencing scripture or his childhood. No cameras, no crowds, just a man, once the most powerful spiritual voice on earth, facing his final hour in simplicity. The silence was sacred. Every breath he took was a prayer. I stood behind the threshold, unable to speak. What I witnessed in that quiet room would etch itself into my soul forever. The rosary that wouldn't leave his hand. Even as Pope Francis drifted in and out of consciousness, one thing remained firmly in his grasp: his rosary. It was old, the beads worn smooth from decades of prayer. A gift from his mother. It had survived Argentina's military dictatorship, his years in the Jesuit order, and his rise to the papacy. He clutched it not with fear, but with familiarity. It was his sword, his comfort, and his last companion. At one point, a doctor gently tried to adjust his grip for medical equipment, but Francis refused with a weak shake of the head. "No, leave it," he rasped. "I go," with her prayers. Her referred to the Virgin Mary, to whom he had been devout since childhood. I watched as he traced each bead with shaky fingers, whispering the Ave Maria. In that moment, the Pope was not just a religious leader. He was a child of faith returning home. The final confession, a whisper in Spanish. Close to midnight, a private moment unfolded, one that few noticed, but I'll never forget. Pope Francis beckoned a young priest, Father Miguel, who had once served with him in Buenos Aires. The old man pulled him close and whispered in Spanish, "Perdóname por lo que no hice." Forgive me for what I failed to do. Father Miguel broke down in tears as he administered the rite of penance. This was no ordinary confession. It was the Pope, face to face with his God, not as a pontiff, but as a man full of regrets, victories, doubts, and deep love. For all his reforms, he mourned what he hadn't achieved, especially for victims of abuse, wars he couldn't stop, lives he couldn't reach. The room stood still. No one interrupted. We were witnessing the most powerful act of leadership, not command, but humility. I still hear his whisper in my dreams. Maria Elena's silent goodbye. As the Pope's breaths grew shallower, his sister Maria Elena stepped closer. She didn't speak. She simply took his hand, the one not clutching the rosary, and pressed it against her cheek. There were no theatrics, no sobs, only quiet, sacred grief. Theirs was a bond shaped by decades of shared suffering, the loss of their parents, the years of political upheaval in Argentina, and the burden of Jorge's rise to papal power. She whispered something in Spanish that I couldn't fully hear, perhaps a childhood nickname or a prayer from their mother's lips. The Pope looked at her and smiled faintly, his eyes wet but peaceful. In that moment, the weight of the Vatican melted away. They were no longer the Holy Father and his sister. They were two souls, bound by blood and eternity. A single tear rolled down her face as she kissed his forehead. That kiss was a final sacrament of love. The room went cold. A presence. Felt at 12:27 a.m. Something changed. The candles flickered. The temperature dropped. The air grew unbearably still. Everyone in the room felt it. I remember gripping the pillar near the doorway as a sudden pressure filled the space, like a wave of silence that had weight. The Pope stirred briefly, opened his eyes wider than before, and looked to the corner of the room. His gaze held there, transfixed, as if he saw something the rest of us could not. A soft gasp escaped the nun beside him. Was it an angel? A vision of Mary? Or simply the brain surrendering to death? I'll never know. But for those few seconds, it felt like the veil between the living and the divine had thinned. I've covered wars, revolutions, and tragedy, but never have I experienced anything so holy or so terrifying. That room, chilled and quiet, became a sanctuary of mystery. Something was there, and it had come for him. The cardinal who wouldn't stop crying. Cardinal Raimondo, known in the Vatican for his stoicism and political brilliance, completely broke down during the Pope's final moments. This was a man who had outmaneuvered ambassadors, rebuked corruption, and survived 5 conclaves. But now he knelt by the Pope's bedside, weeping openly like a child. His sobs weren't just grief. They were guilt, regret, and helplessness. Earlier in Francis's reign, Raimondo had opposed several reforms. They clashed often about finances, tradition, transparency. But in the end, Raimondo had come to love Francis, not just as a pope, but as a man of unmatched courage and kindness. The old cardinal whispered apologies between sobs. "You were right, Holy Father. You were right." It was the confession of an enemy turned admirer. Francis, barely conscious, lifted a trembling hand and brushed his fingers against Raimondo's collar. forgiveness in its purest form. The deathbed of a pope had turned even the most powerful man in red into a boy begging absolution. The phone call he never answered. On a small table near the pope's bed sat a single buzzing phone. It rang once, then twice. A name flashed across the screen: Tagle. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, seen by many as the spiritual heir to Pope Francis. No one answered the call. The Pope was already too weak, too far gone. I found myself staring at the screen, heart pounding. Why had Tagle called at this hour? Had he known? Had someone warned him? The unanswered call became symbolic. A bridge left uncrossed. We would later learn that Tagle was in Asia at the time, praying in a monastery. But some whispered that the call was prearranged, for something more than a goodbye. Was it political, spiritual, or merely personal? I'll never know. But I'll never forget the sound of that unanswered phone, cutting through the silence like a ghost of what could have been. It rang for the last time, then went still forever. The moment the clock stopped, at exactly 12:59 a.m., the ornate wall clock in the Pope's room stopped ticking. No one touched it. No power failure. No mechanical explanation. The second hand froze. The candlelight dimmed. Then, the room fell utterly silent. A physician reached over, checked the Pope's pulse, and slowly nodded. The Holy Father had passed. But it wasn't just death. It felt like time itself had bowed in reverence. I watched as one cardinal dropped to his knees. A nun fainted. Maria Elena clutched her brother's hand one last time and whispered, "Gracias, Jorge." Then she let go. I have covered death before. But this was something else. The Pope's final breath was not just the end of a life, but the end of a chapter in the spiritual history of the world. As the clock stood frozen, I realized history had been made in front of me, and no amount of journalism would ever do it justice. The whisper of a confession. In the final moments before Pope Francis's breath ceased entirely, he whispered something. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but I was close enough to hear the shape of his words. They weren't Latin rites, they weren't final blessings, they were personal. I saw it. In the corridors. They knew. I froze. Who knew? What did they see? His words were fractured, but heavy with truth. Maria Elena leaned in closer, holding his face, and gently shushed him. But the look in her eyes told me she heard it too, and that she understood exactly what he meant. The Pope had secrets. Every Pope does. But this sounded more like a warning, a final burden being cast out in the last seconds of lucidity. It was as if he was trying to cleanse himself before crossing into eternity, not from sin, but from silence. That whisper is now burned into my soul, and it still keeps me awake. The black folder under his bed. As attendants prepared to begin the post-death rituals, a Vatican aide reached under the bed to retrieve a cloth for the body. Instead, he pulled out a worn leather folder, black, weathered, and sealed. No one had seen it before. Maria Elena's eyes widened. She stepped forward but said nothing. The aide froze, unsure what to do. Cardinal Raimondo took the folder, held it against his chest, and said only one thing: "This is not for now." The mystery deepened. What secrets did it hold? Theories abound, unpublished letters, sealed instructions, or perhaps the truth behind the Pope's final projects. Some believe it was Francis's personal account of corruption inside the Vatican, a written testimony meant to outlive him. That folder vanished that night, never seen again. The Church would later deny it even existed. But I was there. I saw it. And I saw the fear it sparked in men who had stood unshaken by war and scandal. The smell of myrrh and blood. In the minutes after Pope Francis passed, the scent in the room shifted. It wasn't incense from the altar. It was something deeper. The air filled with the unmistakable fragrance of myrrh, ancient and sweet, layered beneath something coppery and unsettling. Blood. Not fresh, but faint. The kind of scent that clings to cathedrals after centuries of prayer and sacrifice. No one acknowledged it, but everyone noticed. I watched as a Swiss guard's hands trembled at his side. A nun covered her mouth. It felt like something ancient had been released into the air. Some say saints, upon death, emit the scent of sanctity. Roses, lilies, or frankincense. Others say it is the odor of unresolved sins burning off. Whatever it was, it carried meaning. The church would never report it. But I swear to you, I will never forget the way it smelled in that room, like holiness and horror mingling together as one, the sacred and the damned. When the lights flickered in St. Peter's, at 1:03 a.m., just minutes after Pope Francis's passing, the lights across the outer halls of the Apostolic Palace flickered. Not once, but 3 times. I was looking out the window when it happened. St. Peter's Basilica stood still in the distance, eerily calm. The Vatican guards looked up. Clergy whispered. In the Catholic world, 3s mean something: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Birth, life, and death. Was it a glitch in the wiring? Maybe, but no one dared investigate. The symbolism was too rich, too chilling. In ancient traditions, flickering lights signify a soul departing, especially if it holds great power. And in that moment, Pope Francis's soul had just crossed over. The basilica didn't ring its bells. The chiming would come later. But the walls of Rome knew. The city knew. A storm rolled in silently. And as the heavens trembled, we all looked at each other and wondered, was this goodbye, or was it something more? The cardinal who refused to pray. In the aftermath, as others began the liturgical rites of passing, one man stood still. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. He arrived quietly, much later than expected. His face was calm, unreadable. But when the circle of cardinals began praying the litany for the dying, Tagle stood apart, arms crossed, silent. It wasn't defiance, but it wasn't reverence either. He didn't kneel, he didn't join the prayers. Instead, he looked directly at the Pope's lifeless face. For what felt like hours, I watched his lips move, speaking to the corpse in private, a conversation no one else could hear. Some say it was mourning. Others believe it was confrontation. Tagle had been close to Pope Francis, but not always in agreement. Rumors swirled that the Pope had once warned others not to fully trust him. In that moment, it felt like Tagle was saying, "You should have listened to me." Whatever passed between them, only one of them took it to the grave.